Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I'm so glad you've joined me here on Now TV. And by the way, I just want to thank you so very, very much for the good response that I am receiving as a result of this investigation of the challenge of Christ. And we've been focusing on Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, and we're not through, all right? But we are addressing, as I shared, the challenge of Christ. Remember what the challenge of Christ is? Jesus said, "Do not believe me for my words' sake, believe me for my works. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me." Now, as I've shared with you before, this is an incredible challenge. It stands head and shoulders above the entire religious world. It is an open invitation from Jesus to examine his life, to examine his works, to examine his claims. And very clearly, Jesus said, hey, if I don't keep my word, don't believe in me. And it's absolutely astounding. And it's troubling. When I read, quote, Christian scholars, look, you can see all of these books here behind me, and I got to tell you, this is not a 10th. It's not a 20th of the books in my library. And the books are written by some of the finest linguistic historians, some of the greatest scholars in the world. And yet, over and over and over, these great scholars say, well, Jesus said he was going to come back in the first century with the angels in flaming fire, and of course we all know he didn't do it, but we're still supposed to believe in him. No, that's exactly the opposite of what Jesus said. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Now look, I've got to tell you, when you can examine the claims of the Mormon religion and the false prophecies made by Joseph Smith, then guess what? We know he was a false prophet. Oh, and then when we examine it in light of other world religions, okay, the false prophecies of Muhammad, for instance, demonstrates he was not a true prophet of God. Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, none of these other religions extend such an open invitation to historical investigation and to verification of the claims being made. None of them. It is therefore imperative, as I have been emphasizing over and over and over again in our studies, that as Christians we be able to meet and to answer the challenge of Christ. Remember what Peter said, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Sanctify, and look, this is in a context of persecution. He said, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, and be ready always to give an answer. The Greek word apologia. It's the Greek word from which we get our word apology. But we think of apology as saying, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry I did that, or I'm so sorry this didn't work out, or I'm so sorry about that. No. That is not the original definition of apologia in the first century. Peter is saying, and the Greek word in the first century meant, and again, the context is persecution. When you are put on trial, and all you got to do is look at 1 Peter chapter 4, 11 and following, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial that is in your midst. Do not let any one of you suffer as a Christian for lying, stealing, murder, adultery, etc. But if any man suffer as a Christian for being a Christian, let him glorify God in this name. And so here is Peter in that context of persecution saying to Christians, we need to be able, if we're brought up on charges for being Christians, and I want to tell you the way it's going in an awful lot of parts of the world, including the U.S. of America, in which an anti-Christian mentality is growing and growing and growing. But again, the point of it is, if you're brought up on charges for being a Christian, then you must be able to answer the charges. Why are you a Christian? Your Jesus failed. He was a liar. He was a false prophet. Can you, ladies and gentlemen, can you meet the challenge of Christ? And so I've been sharing with you the background, the prophetic source of one of the greatest predictions of the end of the age, quote, end of the world, unquote, prophecies to be found anywhere in the New Testament, and that's 2 Peter chapter 3. And my argument has gone something like this. Peter said, number one, he was reminding his readers of what the Old Covenant prophets had foretold about the last days. What the Old Covenant prophets had foretold about the day of the Lord in the last days. And I've shared with you that in Isaiah chapters 2 through 4, which is one continuous prophecy, there is no break. You can't break it up into, oh, well, that belongs back then, this belongs up here. No, no, no. It is all one united prophecy of what would happen in the last days. Now, let me point out again to you, it is commonly asserted, well, the last days are the Christian age. I was raised believing that, okay? So it is generally believed that the entirety of the Christian age that has lasted for 2,000 years now is the last days. And at the same time, it is said, believed, and taught, God was through with Israel at the cross. God nailed the old covenant, the entirety of it, to the cross. Well, that's abundantly strange, because if God was through with Israel at the cross, if he had nailed the old covenant to the cross, and he was no longer dealing with old covenant Israel in any way whatsoever, he was not concerned with the fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel, then why is it that we come to Acts chapter 2, and when the Spirit is poured out that day, Peter said, brethren, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. Hey, you know what? I'm pretty sure the book of Joel is not a New Testament book. It's not a New Covenant book. So what's Peter doing? He is saying that the events of that day were in fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel. Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Remember, God was supposedly through with old covenant Israel at the cross. He had already supposedly fulfilled all of the Old Testament at the cross. Well, obviously, he had not fulfilled all of the Old Testament at the cross, because Peter said, what is happening here this day is in fulfillment of Joel. And he said that 50 days after the cross. He then went ahead to quote from the Psalms. He then went ahead to quote from Deuteronomy 32, verse 5, and to warn his audience, save yourselves from this wicked and perverse generation. That's Deuteronomy 32, verse 5. And catch the power of this, folks. Deuteronomy 32 is the Song of Moses that tells us twice that it is about Israel's last days. So, again, you got to catch the power of this. If Israel's last days were consummated, finished, completed at the cross, then Peter was entirely wrong in applying Deuteronomy 32, verse 5, to events 50 days after the cross. Do you see that? You catch that? Peter, what's wrong with you, man? Don't you know that God was through with Israel at the cross? Don't you know that Deuteronomy 32 was fulfilled at the cross and that God had nailed the old law to the cross? And Peter says, well, no such thing. Save yourselves from this generation. Quoting Deuteronomy. Listen, folks, from Acts chapter 2 onward, the entire book of Acts and all of the epistles are the record of God's fulfillment in the first century, the ongoing fulfillment at that time of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Now, by the way, some years ago, I produced a 52-lesson series. It is in MP3 form on Acts and the restoration of Israel. And I want to tell you, that study changed my life. It revolutionized my entire thought process concerning Israel, the old law, and what we call the New Testament, and the book of Acts specifically. That study is available on my website, DonKPreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. You can go there, go to the store, and just look up Acts and the Restoration of Israel. Now, you can order it in two different ways. You can order a download at a greatly reduced price, or you can order the discs, or the disc of the actual audio, so that you can have the disc in your library, okay? But the point of fact is, this is it, folks. And believe me when I say this. You may never, ever look at the book of Acts in the same way. You may never think of eschatology in the same way. You may never think of the old law in the same way. You may never think of Old Covenant Israel in the same way if you get that series on Acts and the restoration of Israel. Okay, I've got to hurry. All of that is very necessary, refreshing our minds of what we are seeing. Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 3, is talking about the last days. He's not talking about the last days of Old Covenant Israel. Listen, if Peter is talking about in 2 Peter chapter 3, okay, once again, you have to catch the power of this. If in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter was anticipating the yet future fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel in the law of Moses, then the concept and the idea that God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross and that He nailed the Old Covenant to the cross is completely, totally false. You catch that? You can't have Peter anticipating the fulfillment of promises that had already been fulfilled. You cannot have Peter affirming the yet future fulfillment of promises and laws that had been abrogated. You cannot have Peter affirming God's faithfulness in the fulfillment of His Old Covenant promises to Old Covenant Israel if Israel ceased to be God's covenant people at the cross. Do you see how anomalous this is? Do you see how disjunctive this claim is? That God was through with Israel at the cross? That He nailed the old law to the cross? Look, folks, anytime you read or hear someone appeal to 2 Peter as a future fulfillment, then you must ask them, is Israel still God's chosen people? Now, of course, the dispensationalists will answer, well, of course they are. But the amillennialists and the postmillennialists will say, oh, no, no, no. Israel does not remain God's chosen people today. God removed the law of Moses in the first century. And by the way, dispensationalists also say God fulfilled the law of Moses and took it completely out of the way at the cross. Well, once again, folks, I'm sorry. You cannot say that God fulfilled the law of Moses, took it out of the way at the cross, and still have Peter anticipating the fulfillment of the law of Moses at some distant point or even imminent point in your future and mine. I'm sorry, that's contradictory. That's unbiblical and wrong. And so, even though I've spent 15 minutes here, almost 16 minutes, going back over this crucial, critical, foundational information, we can never lose sight of these things. So Peter is predicting the last days, the day of the Lord, the judgment of the wicked. Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 foretold Israel's last days and the day of the Lord and the judgment of the wicked. Now, I promised you last week, and oh, by the way, let me take just a brief digression here, all right? I promised you last week that I was going to show you something absolutely remarkable today, and so I'm going to keep my word, and I've got to hurry. I've only got a few minutes left here. What we saw last week is this. From Isaiah chapter 2, 19 and following, remember, Isaiah is speaking about the last days. And he is talking about the day of the Lord. And he describes it like this. They shall go into the holes of the rocks, into the caves of the earth, from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty when he arises to shake the earth mightily. Okay. The last days, day of the Lord. Isaiah is predicting it. Peter is predicting it. Where's the difference between Isaiah's last days, day of the Lord, and Peter's last days, day of the Lord, especially when Peter reminds us he's only talking about what the Old Covenant prophets foretold. So if Peter is about a different day of the Lord in the last days from what Isaiah is talking about, then we got to have the proof of that, don't we? Okay, remember now, all right? Remember what I've shared with you. This day of the Lord would be a time when men could run to the mountains and hide in the caves to escape the day of the Lord. Folks, once again, let me remind you, if this is talking about some end of time, end of human history event that is over, boom, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, then guess what? Nobody can escape it. Nobody has time to go and run to the mountains. It just doesn't work. And yet, twice in Isaiah chapter 2, 19 through 21, the prophet said, in this last days, day of the Lord, men would run to the mountains. They would hide in the caves. They'd cry out to the rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the day of the Lord. Folks, we just got to use good common sense to know this cannot be speaking about an end of time coming of the Lord. All right. Since it cannot be talking about an end of time, end of the cosmos, end of the world, day of the Lord, that is over in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, that's eliminated. As I shared with you over a 2-week period of time, in Luke chapter 23, 28 to 30, Jesus was being led to his crucifixion, to his death. The women of Jerusalem were following him and crying and lamenting and moaning, weeping. And he turns to them and he says, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. weep for yourselves and for your children. Now, as I pointed out, this is critical. That terminology for you and your children is a one-generational reference. It does not ever refer to 20 generations later, 30 generations later, 100 generations later. It's to you and your children. Now watch this. If they do this in a green tree, what will they do in a dry? For the time will come in which they run to the mountains and they cry to the rocks, fall on us. Well, what's he doing? He's quoting directly from Isaiah chapter 2. Okay, so here is Jesus warning the women that within a one generational period of time, Isaiah 2, 19 to 21 would be fulfilled. So, here's where we're at. It really doesn't matter on one level how you define the day of the Lord. Jesus' reference to you and your children confines the fulfillment of Isaiah 2, 19 to 21 to a one generational period of time. Now let me repeat what I just said. This terminology, you and your children, is only used some 7 to 9 times in the New Testament. It invariably refers to a one generational period of time. It never refers to 10 generations down the road, 20, 30, 50, or 100 generations down the line. So to drive this point home by repetition, Jesus in Luke chapter 23, 28 to 30, applied Isaiah 2, 19 to 21 to a one generational period of time. So that means, however we define the day of the Lord of Isaiah 2, it had to be fulfilled within a one generational period. And you know where that puts us? In AD 70. Because here's what's critical about this. I've made comment before that it's absolutely remarkable when you find any given text that there is virtual unanimous agreement, virtually no disagreement by the scholars, by the commentators, that a given text means a given thing. Well, guess what? Luke 23, 28 to 30 is one of those absolutely remarkable texts that when you read the literature and all these commentaries, there is virtual 100% agreement that in Luke 23, 28 to 30, Jesus was referring to the impending judgment on Jerusalem. Why? For crucifying him, and as we shall see, for persecuting his followers. Okay, so we have Isaiah predicting the last day of the Lord. That simply cannot textually, contextually, prophetically, ever refer to an end of time, earth burning, history ending day of the Lord. It just, again, ladies and gentlemen, it referred to a period of time in which men could run from the day of the Lord and hide in the caves. And I think you know, in your heart, in your mind, in your soul, that cannot be an end of the world event. Okay, so once again, and I don't mean to belabor these points, but you know, sometimes it takes us hearing something from a couple of different perspectives in order for it to go boom. I mean, how many times have we heard something over and over and over and over again, and you know, we just didn't get it? And then all of a sudden one day, because we have more information in our database, all of a sudden we hear it and it just explodes in our mind. So if it is the case that the last days, day of the Lord of Isaiah, chapters 2 through 4, cannot be an earth-burning, time-ending event, and if it is true that Jesus applied the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 2, 19 to 21, to his generation, then it cannot be true that what Jesus was predicting was different from what Isaiah predicted. That means that the day of the Lord of Isaiah chapter 2, 19 to 21, again, would be fulfilled in a one generational period of time in Jesus' generation, and that means the day of the Lord would be fulfilled. And remember, we're talking about the last days, day of the Lord, that Peter is predicting in 2 Peter chapter 3. Ask yourself one more time, was Peter predicting a last days, day of the Lord, which was foretold by the Old Covenant prophets, that was different from the last days, day of the Lord, foretold by Isaiah, and that Jesus applied Isaiah chapter 2 to his generation? Now, if a person wants to argue that Peter was predicting a different last days, day of the Lord from that foretold by Isaiah and applied by Jesus to his generation, then we have every right in the world to ask, where is that evidence? You can't just say, oh, well, they're obviously different. I'm sorry, that's no proof. Okay, look, I'm really out of time today, and I didn't get to where I wanted to go, but I wanted to go back over some territory and offer some new information. Thank you for joining me. Do not miss next week. I'll see you there.